So I was scrolling through my Instagram page and I was going through the stories and I landed on this post from the Know Your Rights Camp, which is the organization that was put together by Colin Kaepernick. And they post a lot of interesting information on that page. But this one right here really stood out to me like a sore thumb because this was something I did not know. And when it comes to public school education or the American education system as a whole, they're not going to teach you about certain things, especially when it comes to our history in this nation. Now, this article that I'm going to read from, now I'm not even going to tell you where the source of the article came from until I get to the end of it, because it's going to shock you where it came from. Because when I was looking through the comments on the Instagram post, people were shocked to hear where this article came from. And to be honest, I was shocked too, and I'm sure you will as well. But the article is basically going to be talking about how the Electoral College is tied in with slavery and the Three-Fifths Compromise. And if y'all don't know what the Three-Fifths Compromise is, then you pretty much are about to find out right here. Now, I said I wasn't going to tell y'all where the article came from, but if y'all saw that little thing that just popped up talking about some ads or whatever, if you caught it, you'll see, you probably caught a glimpse of where it came from. But anyway, this article was posted in July of this year. But the way that it got put out there, you would think that it got posted this week, considering, the election and all that stuff, all that good stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and read this article and see what we can find out. Because like I said, this is all brand new to me. White supremacy is systemic. It lives in policies like law and order policing and access to public goods and services. It thrives in politics with systems that Americans rely on to elect leaders, like the Electoral College, a process originally designed to protect the influence of white slave owners, which is still used today to determine presidential elections. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, state delegates came together to draft what will become the U.S. Constitution, establishing the rule of law for the newly founded United States of America. The country, still in its infancy, had liberated itself from the colonial rule of Great Britain's King George III in the American Revolution. With George Washington presiding, the delegates discussed the current state of affairs among the 13 states governed under the Articles of the Confederation, which was proving insufficient in maintaining federal governance among the states. At the urging of Virginia delegate James Madison and others, they began to draft a new national constitution, which would design the role and power of the new government, including elections ahead of state. But steeped in the throes of the slave trade and a little less than 100 years before the Civil War, there was already a divide between the interests of northern and southern states. The idea of a simple popular vote election struck fear in delegates from slaveholding states because while their states boasted large populations, much of the populace was comprised of enslaved black people who could not vote. By contrast, northern states had smaller population with a greater number of eligible voters, such as white, male, and generally property owning. The right of suffrage was much more diffusive in the northern than the southern states, and the latter could have no influence in the election on the score of Negroes, said Madison, who would later become the nation's fourth president. The substitution of electors obviated this difficulty and seemed, on the whole, to be liable to the fewest objections. Fearful of being outnumbered, Madison pushed for the Electoral College and championed representative government by state as a solution. Seats in the House of Representatives will be based on population size, and delegates from slaveholding states sought to have slaves included in the count for total population. Those opposed recognized this would mean fewer seats from the smaller states, and so the states made several compromises. The first, known as the Three-Fifths Compromise, was a racist manipulative policy that outlined the rules for legislative representation and taxation on the states. It read, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to the respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed 3/5 of all other persons. Enslaved black people, ordinarily only regarded as property, were declared 3/5 of the person in order to strengthen the power of the white men who kept them in bondage. It will remain that way until the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to slaves in 1868. So you got to think, slaves or black people at that time who were enslaved were known as 3/5 of a human being for well over 100 years. That's a long time. And people try to say, oh, it's not on the books anymore. They may not have it written down there in the Constitution anymore, but if you look around and see how everything is structured, it pretty much still plays out to this day. The second compromise was the advent of the Electoral College in deciding the general election. Instead of popular votes, electors would make the selections on behalf of their states. The way electors were chosen varied by state, but they were usually elected officials and party leaders, as is true today. The number of electors for each state was set to equal its total number of congressional representatives, 2 senators, and however many representatives it had in the House. In 1961, the District of Columbia will be awarded 3 electoral votes as well. There is no federal law that governs how electors cast their vote. This too was determined by state law. Both now and then, candidates had to receive a majority of electoral votes to win an election. So in deciding how to elect the leaders of the government, slaveholding states were advantaged by the size of their slaveholding populations. Let me read that part again. In deciding how to elect the leaders of government, slaveholding states were advantaged by size of their slave holding populations. Loosely translated, the more slaves they had, the more electorates they were granted. Basically, Virginia, which boasted the largest total population, saw many of its own occupy the White House in the early years of presidency, including Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Madison. The impact of the Electoral College and the dominance of Southern electors is even clearer when considering how many presidents were slave owners themselves, 12 in all, including 8 who owned slaves while in office. Still many others endorsed state rights, coded language that's still used today, with the introduction of emerging voter suppression laws designed to alienate and disenfranchise voters. Since its creation, there have been 4 elections where the Electoral College winner did not receive the popular vote. 2 have come this century. The 2000 election between Al Gore and George W. Bush, and the 2016 election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Both of these instances have drawn the ire of Electoral College critics, who say the system is outdated and should be replaced with one person, one vote. Direct elections that truly represent American democracy. And if y'all didn't catch that little pop-up that came on the screen early on in the video when I told you I didn't want to tell you who the source was because it would surprise you. If you didn't catch it, this article was posted by Teen Vogue. This was one of the more shocking things about this was not so much what was in the article, but where the article came from. Teen Vogue, of all places. But I did learn something new today. I mean, when you think about it, in this nation, everything can be tied back to slavery. The building up of this establishment from our ancestors, the theft of funds and resources to build up other economic structures that we still don't get paid off of today. And now this, a huge component in selecting a president for every 4 years, is tied into this. So I think the biggest takeaway, and there was a lot of takeaways from this article, was the part where they said that the more slaves that a person had per state is where the more electorate votes they received. And they said Virginia, how ironic, they said Virginia had the largest population of slaves. And the reason that is, in case y'all didn't know, when the transatlantic slave trade began here, the very first stop they made was in Virginia. And I believe the place was called Jamestown, if I'm not mistaken. So it would make sense that Virginia had the largest slave population because it was the hugest slave port. It was the first stop. It was the main stop, as a matter of fact. I keep telling people Virginia is a reason why I say Virginia is one of the most racist states in America. It's because one of the major reasons of what I just told you. It can be linked back to being a main slave port. All them Lynchburgs and bills and everything they got out there, they earned those titles for their cities. But this is a very interesting article. Like I said, I did learn something new, but like I said, it's not so surprising at the same time because like I said, look at the Civil War. The Civil War, what did they fight about? Slaves. They had whole wars that was linked back to slavery. So this right here, like I said, is new, is information that needed to be put out there. We know they're not going to talk about it in schools. When it comes to slavery, they're going to leave this part out. See, this is yet again black people saving this nation that has done nothing for us, but has done everything to us, and not to our benefit. But then when we ask about reparations, which by the way, well, more so demand, but by the way, now this little piece right here can be added into another reason as to why we need reparations and why we should get it. But when we demand reparations, they say, oh, you're no longer slaves and everything like that. But look at, we may not be in bondage anymore, like how they are pictured in this image. And this could be a fabricated image, because I refuse to believe that it looked this nice. But we may not be in bondage anymore like how our ancestors were. But the benefits of this establishment, this nation that we live in, that has been able to thrive throughout centuries and decades, years, whatever, is linked back to the slave labor that my ancestors and whoever who was born here, their ancestors, our ancestors, it all comes from that. Even down to selecting a sitting president. But that's really all I have to say right now as it pertains to this topic. I could probably really go in, but I think y'all get the gist of it. I'll leave the link to the article down below so y'all can go ahead and check it out at your own leisure, or just send people to this video. Y'all let me know what you think down in the comments, and I'll talk to you in the next one.